Okay, so good afternoon, BSE. Okay, so for this afternoon, we are going to have the chapter 2 of our discussion or the lesson about the literary criticism. Okay po. So again, this is the chapter 2 of literary criticism. So guys, enable for me to identify that you have watched the video presentation. Please use your handouts, highlight there, or you could put down or write down the notes that you have gathered during this online discussion. Okay po. Okay, so again, use your handouts for me to identify that you watch this video presentation. Okay po. So for this afternoon, so we have the literary criticism. So before you listen or before you watch this video presentation, make sure you watch the review or you listen to the review of your classmate, of your chosen classmate, which I had sent on our what is this? Our GC. Okay po, para po ma-review tayo sa laman or content nung module natin na ginawa ko po last week. And then, this is the continuation. Okay, so let's first have literary analysis. So when we say literary analysis, okay, so actually, literary analysis, if we could see there, this is a combination of two terms. Okay, so from this concept, we have two terms that themselves contain an individual and authentic meaning. So first one, we have analysis. Punta muna tayo sa analysis. And then we have literary. So when we say analysis po, literary or analysis itself is the examination of reality, okay, susceptible to intellectual study that through the distinction and separation of its parts po, okay, allows knowing its constituent element and principle. So when we say susceptible, okay, so when we say susceptible, susceptible, so that is one of the characteristic of analysis. Okay, so when we say that, susceptible means liable, okay, it means defenseless against. Okay, so when we do analysis, that is liable, okay, or that is reliable because it um it have a due process or it has a lot of process to identify or to conduct analysis. Tama po? Okay, so sabi po ni, so we have a quotation, okay, with regards or about analysis, which is from Dalai Lama. Okay, so Dalai Lama is a poet. Okay, so he is an author. Okay, so sabi niya po dito, and he is a researcher. Okay, so sabi niya po, the ultimate authority must always rest with the individual own reason and critical analysis. Okay, so when we say the ultimate authority must always rest with the individual own reason and critical analysis, a person should be guided or should have the authority or should be controlled with the critical analysis. So when we say that, okay, so pag sinabi pong ganon, a person, when he do decision making, when he is about to decide on something or to make something, okay, so he should do critical analysis and wise reasoning, okay, so that is very important. And according to Frank Lloyd Wright, okay, again, Frank Lloyd Wright, he is also a writer, okay, a researcher. Analysis should be a habit of our mind. Okay, so when we say analysis should be a habit of our mind, analysis should be done always whenever we are about to do something, whether that is a big decision, a small decision, a practical doing in our life. We should do analysis. Tama po? Because the purpose of analysis is for us to do not done mistake, okay, with accordance of what we are doing. And another thing, when we do analysis, it is a functional way for us to identify that we are doing a right thing. Okay, so that is analysis. Okay, so meaning, mga anak, through the help of analysis, we will have or we will be engaged into intellectual studies. So, sinabi ko din kanina. Okay? So, it engage or it involve us to critical thinking. Okay? We do research and we do reflection with regards our reality. Okay? So, when we say analysis, that is not just an opinion. That is not just based on our own understanding, but it rather go through a critical thinking for us to identify that we are doing analysis. Okay? And when we say literary, literary is that belonging or related to literature. Okay? So literary. This term, which comes from the Latin term literae, okay, or litera, okay, actually literature comes from the Latin term litera, okay, is linked to the body of knowledge to write or read well. Literature is an art that has language as a meaning of expression. So when we say literary or literature, it comes from the Latin term literary or litera. Okay, so ano pong ibig sabihin nun? So it is concerning in the writing, okay, study, or content of literature. So I have a subject Philippine literature back then. And when we say literature, it doesn't deal only with the written text, with written books. Okay? Kasi po pag ang bata, narinig nila ang term na literature, they could identify that it is a book. Okay? Their basic example is a book. Pero hindi po. Okay? So actually now, in our generation today, multimedia or social media, okay, is included already in literature because in the form of social media, we could create text. Tama po. Okay? Pero tayong Wattpad na tinatawag, it is not printed, it is not a hardbound, but since it has a text, it has meaning, it could interpret feelings and experience of other people, therefore it could be considered as literary or literature. So therefore, literary analysis, pag pinagsama po natin yung dalawang combination or dalawang terminology, it is consists of an evaluation to crumble and recognize the different aspects to make up work. It works by examining the plot, the theme, exposition, style, and other issues about literary work. Okay, so that is the main function of literary analysis. So when we say crumble po, this one, crumble, it means to break into analysis. So it is not just simply reading. When we say literary analysis, we do not just go through beyond our understanding, but rather we do crumble and recognize the different aspect of the work. So we go to the history, why that book or why that specific literature was been made, and we go through the idea or the purpose of the author. Why is that literature has been made? Okay, so that is literary analysis. So literary analysis is very important. Okay, because diba, um, reading itself or reading a literature without proper understanding about it, okay, or literature, reading literature without a proper understanding, or we just read it, di ba na-experience natin, when we um, read literature, we came to the point of our life na parang wala naman ako naiintindihan, okay? So literary analysis is very important for you to better appreciate the work of the author, okay? So we have literary criticism as a tool of interpreting literature. Okay, so first, let us define what is interpretation. What is the definition or the exact definition of of interpretation outside literature? We also have the what kind of questions help with interpretation, or simply what is the help of interpretation. Okay? So number one, what is interpretation? In general, interpretation or to interpret something is to make it personally meaningful. Our brain take raw data from the senses and make it meaningful by relating it to a previous experience. So let us remind ourselves that when we say interpretation, take note of this term, personally meaningful. Personally, okay? So when we say interpretation, that is a personal idea. Okay? So when we say interpretation, that is a personal basis of how you understand specific text or how you perceive, how you understand specific idea. Okay, so that is interpretation. That is personal. Okay po. So sabi dyan, our brain take raw data from the senses and it's meaningful. It's meaningful by relating to our previous experiences. So another function or characteristic of interpretation, it doesn't require studying. It doesn't require analysis. It doesn't require wide range of ideas, okay? It just requires us to do or to go back to our previous experiences, okay? So for example, okay, we respond or we heard a loud noise, okay? So when we heard a loud noise and that is sounds like a gunshot, okay, one would interpret that someone has been killed, okay, or someone or the another person would interpret that merong malakas ang trip na nagpaputok ng kanyang ano, ng kanyang baril. Okay? So we have different interpretation, 'di ba? So that's why a barrier called misunderstanding is been built because we have a person have different interpretation of an idea. Okay? So that is um interpretation. So when we read or hear a sentence po, okay, in literary analysis or here in literary criticism, we put the words together into a meaningful whole rather than just noting the separate dictionary definition. That is what we call interpretation. Okay? So I hope that is understood. So when we say this one, okay, for example po, I have an example of statement which is a proverb. Okay, so many of the author use this proverb in able to identify a certain or specific idea. So sabi dito, do not cry over the spilled milk. I repeat, do not cry over the spilled milk. So when we identify this one, so when we translate this into Filipino language, word per word, okay? Wag mo daw iyakan ang spilled means natapon, nagatas. Okay? So when we say that, okay, so basically that would mean, or let's engage ourselves in a conversation with a kid, okay, na we are talking to him or her na wag mo nang iyakan yan or wag mo nang panghinayangan, magtitimpla na lang tayo ulit. Okay? Pero po, since this is a proverb, okay, and people have different interpretation, the importance of a literary analysis or literary interpretation is that we have to know why is the author include this proverb on his statement. So basically, when you translate this proverb into certain explanation, ang ibig sabihin po niyan, wag mo nang iyakan ang bagay na hindi mo na makukuha pa. Intindihan? Okay. So simply, this proverb is example of a statement under different interpretation because once you do not study or once you do not interpret the literature well or analyze why is that the specific author include this proverb into his or her writings, okay, we couldn't identify what is the definition of this. So simply, this proverb means do not regret on the things that have passed through. Tama po? Huwag mo nang paghinayangan yung bagay na wala na, natapos na. Okay? So, ganun po ang ibig sabihin nito. Okay, so what? Next question, what kind of question help with interpretation? Or simply mga anak, what is the help of interpretation? So, specific questions that allow only one answer. Okay? So, like, for example, what is the main or who is the main character? Okay? So, it may enable a teacher, it may enable us to see if you student has read or studied the story. Okay? So, but they rarely challenge the reader to see beyond the plot level. Okay? Because that is not interpretation already. Okay? Or that is not interpretation, but that is analysis already. Okay? Because they respect the complexity po of your own experience and the author's vision. Okay? So, open-ended questions po are just more meaningful or useful here in interpretation. So, what are the questions that we could answer when we do interpretation? So, specific questions lang po. Kasi I repeat, when we say interpretation or literary interpreting literature po means we just have to rely on our previous ideas, on our previous experiences, rather than doing critical thinking because that is literary analysis. Okay? So that is um, interpretation of literature. Okay, so now let us focus on what is literary criticism. Okay? So first class, let us answer the question, why should we interpret literature? I repeat, we should answer the question, why we should interpret literature. So number one is the first level of understanding. Tama po. Interpretation is the first level of understanding. Let us remind ourselves. Although the interpretation of literature po could be challenging, okay? It may also provide unique and important rewards, okay? Such as you have to conduct or to do um, um, crumbling, or we have to conduct different or certain ways for us to engage ourselves on our previous ideas or experiences. Okay, but interpreting literature is very important. Okay, so authors of fictions, poetry, or ano pa ba, drama, choose literature for their experience, for their expression po, because they believe that these are the ways to interpret their feelings and ideas. I repeat. So, we should interpret literature because it is the way of the author for him to explore or to make expression of what he feel, what he felt, or what is idea that he wants to share to us. Okay? So, reading and interpreting literature po then nourishes us with a sense of complexity of life's deepest mystery. So, what are the topics? Okay? What are the genres? Not genre pala, topic po, or content of literature that we could interpret. Okay? So, what are the level of of topic or ideas that we could interpret? Okay? So, that is love, okay, hate, death, conflicts between individual or society po, okay, and so on. So that when we approach these problems, okay, we do so with great self-awareness and greater tolerance for the views of the others, most especially the author. Okay? So we may react angrily. For example po, okay, so ma'am, si yung mga logical po bang mga literature, papasok po siya sa literary interpretation? Hindi po. Okay, so automatically, that is between literary analysis and literary criticism. Because when we say literary interpretation, that is just a shallow interpretation, or that is a shallow basis of understanding literature. Okay? Okay. So, for example po, we may react angrily, 'di ba? Ang bilis nating maging yung tolerance ng pagiging reactive natin pag nakakarinig tayo ng mga balita. Like for example, pinatay, iniwan, 'di ba? We tend to be angry. Okay? So our response is to react angrily. Okay? So do you know the truth? I have read an article, the truth behind Will Smith. Okay. Kasi po si Will Smith daw is nananakit ng, anong tawag dito? Ng mga interviewer. Okay? Nananakit daw ng mga, alam mo yun, may mga passive emotion siya na kung saan nananakit siya ng mga tao sa paligid niya. Okay? So when we know that, we tend to hate that specific person, or rather, we tend to do not like that person at all because of that one thing that we know about that person. But when we read the story, okay, or but when we know the whole story, okay, of that specific person or that specific idea or news, okay, we are asked to understand, okay. So without necessarily excusing such as action, okay, we can identify na okay, kaya pala ganito, okay. So the reason why Will Smith become that person is because pinalaki siya ng magulang niya na abusive. Okay? So, ganun po. So, we have to go beyond the 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 author's words or the author's comprehension or ideas of making the literature before we understand fully. Okay? We have to conduct literary analysis and interpretation. So, in our real life naman, di ba, we have to enable for us to really know the truth. Okay? We have to conduct analysis. Okay? Mahirap na po sa pagkakataon ngayon yung we tend to suggest, we tend to give our views, we tend to give our opinion, but we don't know the whole truth of what really happened. Okay? So, when we do this, okay, when we interpret literature po, mga anak, makinig mabuti, when we do literary interpretation, we are taking what we already know about the human nature and adding into the experience and wisdom of the author. Okay? So even if we don't share all the author's convictions, okay, so interpretation then is a social act. We bring to it all of our past experience with people and we come away with an even richer or more complex understanding. Okay? So that is literary interpretation. Okay, so sabi po dyan, a literary interpretation is a detailed personal analysis of a passage of text. Let us take note that when we say literary interpretation, that is a personal analysis, focusing specifically on the text itself. It should not be focused with a literary analysis essay. Again, it should not be focused on the literary analysis essay as it does not need a thesis statement. Okay? So when we say that interpretation should have thesis statement or general discussion of the book as a whole, that is literary analysis. But when we say personal analysis, that is literary interpretation. So the literary commentary should only analyze and reflect on the specific passage. Okay? So let us take on our mind that when we say interpretation, that is just a commentary, a suggestion, an opinion, a view. Okay? So I hope that is clear. Okay, so what is literary criticism? So literary criticism is an extension of the social activity of interpreting. I repeat, literary criticism is an extension of the social activity of interpreting. One reader writes down his or her views on what a particular work of literature means so that others can respond to that interpretation. And that is literary criticism. The critic's specific purpose may be to make value judgment on a work, to explain his or her interpretation of the work, or to provide other readers with relevant historical or biographical information. The critic's general purpose, in most cases, is to enrich the reader's understanding of the literary work. Critics typically engage in a dialogue or debate with other critics, using the views of other critics to develop their own points. Unfortunately, when critics assume that their readers are already familiar with previous criticism, the argument may be difficult to follow. Okay? So, ibig sabihin po, makinig mabuti, ibig sabihin when people give their meaning of a certain literature, I repeat, ibig sabihin, when people give their meaning of a certain literature by putting their idea on the level of their understanding, okay, and with their level of their experience, that is literary interpretation. I repeat, kapag ang isang tao or group of people give their meaning of a certain literature, pag binasa nila yung literature, they give meaning by putting their ideas on the level of their understanding, okay? Or by adding or by just depending it on their understanding or experience, that is literary interpretation. And when people give judgment to the interpretation of certain group of people, I repeat, when people naman po, when this group of people give judgment to the interpretation of different group of people, ang tawag na po naman po doon is literary criticism. Okay? So, kung mapapansin natin, one reader writes down his or her views on one particular work of literature means so that others can respond to that interpretation. And that is what we call criticism. Kasi mga anak, when we describe the basic definition of literary or of criticism, it means it is the expression of judgment. Okay? And when we say judgment, that is the approval or disapproval of a person, okay, of something based on specific or perceived ideas. Okay? So that is literary criticism. If all interpretations were combined and we do judgment to them, to that interpretation, ang tawag po doon ay literary criticism. Okay? So what do we use or when do we use criticism and how to incorporate literary criticism into paper? So, okay, so mentioned here, occasionally you may want to begin with some preliminary literary research to make sure that there is enough critical commentary available, particularly if you're considering writing about a recent author. Okay? So when do we use criticism? Sabi po dyan, okay? We should begin or we could begin, okay, in doing some research about preliminary literary research, okay, to make sure that there is enough critical commentary available, okay. So when we cannot do criticism if there is no interpretation by different author or different people, okay, particularly if you're considering writing about a recent author. Okay, so simply po, mga anak, you may also want po pala, no? You may also want to do a basic overview or article in a reference work before beginning to read and interpret a particular difficult work. Okay, so nevertheless po, it's, what is this? Is usually best not to worry about literary criticism until, okay, literary interpretations are provided. Okay? You've already developed your own basic interpretation din po of the work. Okay? So if you later find a critic who arrives at the same conclusion you've reached, okay? Or ang ibig sabihin po nun, if one interpretation combined or have the same interpretation as yours, okay, you can still use the critic as a support. Okay? Remember that the main purpose of your writing or remember um, that the purpose of your criticism is to express and support your views or the views of the author, okay, on the original literature, not to quote many critics as possible. Okay, so how to incorporate literary criticism into paper? Okay, so just as it's usually best to read criticism after you've developed your own views, so do you normally refer to or quote criticism after you express an idea of your own. Okay? So, ibig sabihin po, a typical paragraph, okay? So, a typical paragraph po may consist, when we do literary criticism, may consist of a topic sentence. Again, a literary criticism should have first an introduction of a topic sentence. Don't worry, hindi naman kayo gagawa ng ganito ngayon. Okay? Expressing po, ano po yung content ng topic sentence? We express the portion or subtopic of your interpretation. So, ibig sabihin po, ang content po ng topic sentence, it should include the summary, okay? Not just the portion po, sorry. Okay? It includes the summary of the content of your paper. What is about the interpretation? Did you agree with the other interpretation or not? Okay, so that should be a topic sentence, followed by an elaboration of the ideas. Okay, you have to elaborate, you have to discuss why did you come up with the topic sentence. Okay, a reference to or a brief quote from the work that you've analyzed. Okay, so make sure that you've quote a certain lines of the author on that specific book. Okay, an explanation of how this passage illustrates your point and the quote or reference from the critic and the passage. Okay, or similar one. And perhaps a brief discussion of the critic's comment. So, ibig sabihin po, when you do literary criticism, when you want to type or write it down, you have to base all your reference on one specific literature. So, ibig sabihin po, when we do conduct literary criticism, we should base everything on what did the author says. Okay? So, we should not take a look on the point of view of the other author, but we have to focus on that specific literature, okay? And we have to gather all the interpretations of different people with regards to literature for us to conduct criticism. Okay, so what are the functions of literary criticism? This is the last one. So the overall functions of literary criticism are not easily compartmentalized. When we say compartmentalized, it could not be divided into section or categories because it is very broad, it is very functional, and is very important. So mga anak, literary criticism is very important din po when we publish textbooks for public schools. So enable for us educators to identify what is the book helpful for the students and those who are not, that are not pala. Okay, we have to conduct literary criticism because some of the content would not be helpful for the student, or rather some of the contents um, were not focused on that specific idea, or some of the content, okay, or meron po content na nawawala, or meron po content na sumobra. Okay, that's the reason why reference, as mentioned here, reference is sorry, wala pala dyan. So reference is very important because when you conduct literary criticism, okay, references should be provided because it's very important when you gather details and ideas. Okay, so if someone were attempt to um, critic work, okay, so if someone were attempt to critic work, a literary work, they might find that they are using a broad spectrum of activities, ranging from book reviews to more in depth theoretical discussions of not only the book, but also the person who wrote the book and the historical events that occurred during the time of the original writing. Yes. Okay? So we have to consider also the time or the historical event that the book was been published because it could affect the culture, it could affect the backgrounds or the reasons why that books was been published. And book reviews have the potential to determine whether or not the book will be sold in mass quantities. Okay, so simply, one of the guiding function of literary analysis is to explore and express shifts of sensitivity that make it possible to evaluate books, as I mentioned earlier. In fact, the only requirement for a new critic is critic. When we say critic, the person, okay, is that the original text survive over the years. So, ibig sabihin, when you do literary criticism, hindi niyo po gagalawin yung literature na ginamit niyo, okay? But it somehow could be improved. It could be progressive, okay? But it would not change, okay? Because the purpose of criticism is for us to help the author to express his or her view wisely. Okay? Literary critics sometimes find that they must wear multiple hats, acting as to the detective, uncovering, verifying, and editing unknown manuscripts. Occasionally, literary critics have the unique opportunity to introduce the public to literary works that have either been forgotten or may not have generated a strong interest in the previous years. Okay? So one of the purpose of literary criticism is to involve other people to read or to engage people to reading. Tama po. Because some of the books or some of the literary works that have been written by specific authors were not engaged or were not new or were not recognized from the previous years, okay, because of some matter, like for example that is a world war, okay, so there is no leisure time or there's no time for the people to read a specific literature, okay. So mga anak, the depth of the function involves a proper literary critic will determine the range of publication and critic appears, okay. So for us to identify that a specific or certain literature undergo literary criticism is the number of publication. Okay po? For example, literary criticisms that are published in the daily press will seldom include detailed analysis and often have little more information than a summary of the publisher's claim for a book interest. Okay? And we also have the magazines. Weekly or bi-weekly magazines will contain slightly more information. Okay? Diba? It has more of pictures, charts, okay, illustrations rather than the text. Okay, however, they are often biased in their judgment in some magazines. Okay, for example, in New York, their books. Okay, so they prefer to publish reviews of more popular books, and it is also possible to find sustained criticism in monthly and quarterly publications, scholarly journal, and the books. Okay, so simply mga anak, the responsibility po of the critic or the literary criticism is not to stroke the ego of the writer, to change the mindset of the writer or the author, but rather to compel the public to become involved in the conversation po of that specific literature and to involve or to develop their own standards of judgment. Okay? So a critic po can be useful to the public because they focus on what the public wants in the literature or popular culture and what they stand to receive from literature and popular culture. So when we notice this one, some of the movies, okay, cartoons were cancelled, okay, because it undergo criticism because sometimes it affects the culture. For example, there is a certain movie that doesn't organize or doesn't use wisely the culture of the specific place where they conducted or they portray their play, the movie, that specific movie will be cancelled because due to literary criticism, meron silang natapakan na law or meron po silang nagawang pagkakamali with against the literature or with against the movie. Okay, so movie pala mga anak, that is included in literature. Okay, because in order for us to make a movie, we have to conduct or the reference that are used are based on scripts and scripts are included in literature. Okay, so interestingly, despite the fact that the literary critics are often the basis of personal opinions of the critics themselves, it is these reviews that helps to create po the thirst for an art in the public. Okay, so it means that it is the role of the critic to identify authentic talents in authors, okay, to make sure that the public has the opportunity to explore those talents. Okay, okay, so that is very important. Again, literary and criticism is very important for us to identify what are the specific learnings or what is the specific traits of the author that we could improve, okay, or what are the details that we have to change in the specific literature. Okay, so that's all BSE. Enable for me to identify that you have learned, please have me the copy of your handouts with the with your jot downs there, okay, and your highlights. So you're just going to take a picture of it and then send it on our group chat. Thank you so much, BSE. God bless.